Alright, time to play some games. On guard! Welcome to Bladen's Sorcery, a physics-based melee combat game with a little bit of magic thrown in there. Now since this is a fighting game, let's go over the types of enemies you'll be fighting. First, there's the swordsmen. These guys are very basic. They're usually just carrying a single weapon, ranging anything from a dagger to a sword, and they're the weakest enemies in the game. These guys are best to train against, as well as just get good at the game. I guess that's the same thing. Anyways, yeah, they're the most plentiful enemy as well. Next up is the shield men. They, as their name implies, are carrying a shield. They, other than that, are exactly the same as the swordsmen, carrying a single other weapon, and that's about it. Simply, their shield will make it a little harder to fight them. There are 3 different types of shields. The buckler is the smallest and the easiest to deal with, leading up to the kite shield being the largest and the hardest to deal with. You'll have to think a little bit more to fight these guys, but they're, all in all, easy to fight. Next up would be archers. These guys are much harder to fight due to them having a bow. This gives them a range advantage over you. However, if you're really good at using the telekinesis spell or just grabbing things, you can actually grab their arrows out of the air and fire them back, which is extremely difficult, but possible. Now, when you do get into melee combat with them, they do have a knife that they will fight back with, as well as they'll attempt to use their bow as a shield. Lastly, there are mages. These are either wielding a dagger if you're in the arena, or they will be wielding a unique staff that cannot be obtained anywhere else if you're in the Dark Ruins. They will also use magic against you, and the only way to defend against this is either a shield, pulling another enemy in front of you, or holding something metallic in the way to attract the electricity. If you don't, these guys can tear down your health really quickly, so be on your guard when there's one around. Now, how you actually start fighting these enemies is by simply walking up to this book. There is one on every map, and starting a wave of enemies. Now let's move on to the actual weapons you'll be using, because, I mean, what's a sandbox fighting game without weapons? I'll be giving the pros and cons of each of the weapons, as well as rating them from 1 to 10, starting with the worst. Now, first up we have the mace. The mace's pros are that, first, it can sweep legs, which I think it is the only one-handed weapon that can do so, which is interesting. It's also pretty good for disarming due to just the blunt force. If you can hit them in the hand, they'll usually drop their weapon. It can be one- or two-handed, so you can kind of use it like a bat if you feel like it. It can stab due to having a small metal spike on the top of it. You can just be absolutely savage with it, which is probably the most fun that you can have with it. It's also pretty fun to throw these, if you can get the throw right and don't get it caught in the shield. Now, the cons of this mace is, one, its length. It's way too short. It's so tiny. Especially when you're trying to sweep legs, like you actually have to like kind of lunge at their legs compared to the other weapons that can sweep. Two, it can't cut, which should be expected considering it's, a blunt object. 3, it's pretty hard to parry with, though this mostly relates to its length, where you have to be very quick with it to parry. And finally, it has really low damage for something that I'd suspect to have high damage. All in all, I'm going to give it, let's say a 4 to 10. Next up, we have the hatchet. This weapon is good in the way that it can easily cut limbs off, even the head, and disarming enemies is still pretty easy with it, especially if they themselves are either wielding an axe or a mace. It can also hook over shields, pulling them down so that you can strike with a second weapon, either a second axe or something else. It can also be one- or two-handed, like the mace, It can be easily thrown, which is kind of fun if you want to just clock someone with an axe from long range. And also it sticks into wooden surfaces, which is kind of fun because, you know, you can stick it into a wooden surface, fight with something else, and then pull it back out later. The cons of it, however, is that it has no way to stab, since it has no sharp end. The only way to damage with it is by hitting with the axe blade, which means that it also has a very small damaging area. It can sometimes get stuck in wooden surfaces, meaning that you'll have to abandon your axe, and hopefully that isn't your only weapon, because then you're going to be stuck with your bare hands. And it can also get easily caught in places like through beams and stuff like that. So it's also quite short like the mace, but with good reason. So I give this weapon a 5 out of 10. Moving on to the swords, there are 2 of them, and they act very similar, so I'm going to be reviewing them at the same time, as well as fighting with both of them at the same time. Now, they have the significant advantages of being able to cut limbs, and also be able to perform draw cuts. What this means is simply placing it on someone and then dragging your sword quickly across them to make a large open cut. As an example of this would be cutting someone's throat. Plus, running someone through with your sword is quite a bit of fun, just straight impaling them through. Throwing them is actually more useful than I thought it would, and they both have a very good length. Now, the downsides to them is that they have no real way to fight against shields. They don't have a hook or anything like that, so against the shield, you're mostly going to have to aim for the legs or wait for them to open up when they attack. And if you run someone through with your sword, there is a chance that it can get stuck, and if you immediately need to fight again, this is not an option. So I will rate them both a 6 out of 10. Next up, we have the rapier. Now, this weapon is also brand new, and I also don't really know how to fight with a rapier naturally, but the pros that I've noticed are stabbing some more, stabbing straight through someone, can sometimes stab straight through shields, which is cool. It is extremely light, pretty fun to throw, like just throwing it like a javelin. It's super easy to parry due to its length, and it's really easy to disarm people with it due to its speed and size. However, its cons are, you can only stab. There's no slicing with this sword, simply because it doesn't have a cutting edge. It's quite easy to get disarmed as well due to the weight of the weapon. Simply a heavy enough hit to your sword or falling and it getting stuck on something, it's coming right out of your hand. It requires a different mindset to use as well, because you gotta simply think that this isn't really a sword, it's more of a syringe, that it can only stab. You can't slash with it at all. And lastly, it's not carried by enemies, so there's no way to obtain another one if you perhaps lose yours. So, all in all, I'll give this weapon a 6.5 out of 10. It's pretty neat. Next, we have the new longsword. Now, this is an interesting weapon, and a lot of people like it. So, let me give a bit of a rundown on it. It is 1- or 2-handed, which is nice, because it's still a small enough sword, but it's 2-handed, which makes it much more powerful. It's still quite light for a 2-handed weapon. It can cut limbs, it can stab pretty well, and it's nice and long, giving you a good reach with it. The downside is that it feels weak in one hand, unless you're stabbing with it, obviously, and it doesn't feel like it's doing enough damage. So all in all, I'll give it a 6.5 out of 10, but this may take some review. Next we got the buckler, and I hear you saying it. Whoa, the buckler is a shield. Why are you counting it as a weapon? Because you can really easily use it as a weapon. So I'm counting it and there's nothing you can do to stop me. So, what are some of the pros? Well, it's really easy to knock people down with it. Simply just throwing it or hitting them in the head with it hard enough and they're going down. You can once again be an absolute savage like the mace. You can still block attacks with it, obviously, since it's a shield, and throwing it like it's a frisbee is pretty damn fun. Cons is, well, it's not a weapon, which means that it doesn't do a lot of damage, which is why it may take 4 or 5 strikes to the head to kill someone with it. However, simply just knocking someone out and tossing them off a cliff is always an option. So I'll give this weapon a 7 out of 10. I guess it's not really a weapon, but you know what I mean. Next up we have the dual-bladed staff, and this is a new weapon that's really cool looking, although when I heard staff I thought it'd be a lot longer, and it wasn't, but I digress. So some of the pros would be pretending to be Darth Maul. That's pretty fun. Yeah, just swinging around this double-bladed weapon. It's also still pretty light for a two-handed weapon. It can cut, which I actually found out while recording this footage. I didn't know that it could cut. It looked like they were pretty much spear points, but no, they're actually sword blades. And lastly, it's really fun for throwing. Unless they survive, because then they'll probably run off with your weapon. Cons for this weapon are that there are only 2 of them that spawn in the entire game, since they don't spawn on enemies. And that means that if you lose both of them, well, you're gonna have to restart to get new ones. So, don't lose them. They're really valuable. Next, they can only go on your back, which is unfortunate. You can't store them on your hip, but then again, there are only 2 of them in the game, so it doesn't matter that you don't have 4 slots available for them. You can't hold them like a bow staff because of a glitch where your the wrists turn into jello. I don't know how to describe it. And lastly, they're not actually very good at cutting, simply due to the kind of awkwardness of them. It's more like you're gonna get cuts by accident rather than on purpose. So all in all, I'll give this weapon a 7 out of 10. Hopefully that glitch gets fixed, and then I definitely rate it higher. Changing directions here, we have the bow. Now the bow is the only non-melee weapon in the game, which makes it quite a different weapon to use. But if you like archery, you'll love the bow. Now, some of its pros are obviously range. It has the longest range in the game. I've been able to hit targets at about 40 feet away, so that's a huge advantage over being able to hit someone from even 10 feet away. It can parry if needed, due to it being quite wide. You can also preload an arrow, like knock one to the string, and then let go of it with your other hand and keep it loaded. Which is good, so that you can walk around with a full quiver, as well as pick an arrow up off the ground and load it into your bow to have a total of 13 arrows. It's excellent against all enemies except for kite shields. The kite shields simply block too much of your target, and you're probably only going to be able to either hit their foot or possibly their hand. And if you get really good with the bow, disarming is possible. It's simply shooting them in the hand to drop their weapon. Now the cons is, it has really low damage. Sometimes it even takes 2 headshots, even at close range. Another con would be that you only get 12 arrows per quiver, and you can only equip 2 quivers at a time. So, only 24 arrows for fighting, say, 30 people that take 2 shots to the head each. So you're going to have to be quickly grabbing arrows, because the next con is that arrows despawn very quickly. So you never want to just leave one in a dead body. They despawn before the body does. It requires a lot of skill to also get up to getting long-range shots, and also both the quiver and the bow can only be stored on your back, which is a disadvantage since you can't store them on your hip. All in all, I give this weapon a 7.5 out of 10, because it's a lot of fun, although, come on, please devs, please give us a bigger quiver. 12 arrows isn't enough. Moving on to the high tier weapons, we got the dagger. Some of its pros are stabbing, throwing, cutting throats, just absolutely feeling badass with it. Disarming is super easy, and the daggers are also super light. Its cons would be its length, although I expected them to be short, and also they can only be on your hip and not on your back, which I also kind of expected. All in all, I'd rate this weapon an 8 out of 10. It's really fun to use. Next up, we have the Bardiche. Now, this weapon I actually had to look up because I'd never heard of it before, and basically it's a huge axe, and that's one of its pros, is being a big axe. With this nature of being a big axe, it can cut limbs super easily. It can sweep legs, or just cut them off. It can stab like a spear. It's two-handed, meaning that it can knock over people with just the handle or outright crush shields. However, its cons are that it's heavy as fuck. It's also super slow and awkward to use in tight spaces, like if you're too close to a wall, you're not going to be able to swing it too well. All in all, I give this weapon an 8.5 out of 10. Now we got the Claymore, the only one of these weapons that I actually own in real life. It's basically just a ginormous sword. Now its upsides would be that it cuts very easily. It's very scary when you see it in action. It can trip people, and it can actually just stab straight through someone. Now imagine this size of sword cutting straight through you. Now, the cons are that it can only go on your back. It's too long, actually. It's a little hard to use, especially in tight quarters, and it's extremely heavy. Even more so in real life. All in all, I give this weapon a 9 out of 10. Now, we move on to the spear. The spear has a ton of advantages, is that it is excellent when it comes to length. It's perfect for stabbing, although that's kind of its point. It's great for throwing, excellent for picking up litter. You can sweep legs with the handle, knock people over with the handle by hitting them in the head, and you can even cut throats with the blade. However, its downsides is that it can get stuck in wooden surfaces, so make sure that you're not stabbing towards a wooden surface when you're trying to attack an enemy. It can only go on your back, although that's expected due to its length. It's pretty awkward in small spaces due to its size. It's got a very small damaging area, so don't attempt to just, swing it full force at someone because you're probably going to hit them with the handle. And I also kind of wish it were longer, as the type of spear that's being used here is actually a boar hunting spear and not a combat spear, meaning that it's much smaller than a combat spear. I was hoping for more one around the size of 6 to 7 feet long, whereas this spear is actually shorter than me. But all in all, I give this weapon a 9 out of 10. Great weapon. Next up we have the Dane Axe, which is an absolutely brutal weapon. It has massive damage, you can easily hit someone with the handle or jab like a spear to knock someone over. Chopping limbs off is a breeze. It's giant, it's somehow light for its size. It's excellent at climbing with a new physics climbing feature. It can trip people simply by pulling their legs towards you. Or you can even outright just crush shields like most two-handed weapons. The cons are that it's impossible to use in one hand. And if you attack at the wrong angle, you're going to be doing almost no damage. You have to hit them directly with the axe blade. You also can't really throw it, unless I guess you threw it like a javelin and just bash someone in the face with the end of the blade. All in all, I give this weapon a 9.5 out of 10, nearly perfect. And lastly, we have my favorite weapon, the chair. I'm being serious. The pros of this weapon is that it has the highest knockdown of any weapon in the game, its damage is high, it's the easiest two-handed weapon to throw, and it's on every map except for the new one, Canyon. However, its cons are, you can't seem to holster it anywhere, nor on your back, nor your hip. I don't know if that's bugged or something, maybe the devs have to look into that, but I can't seem to holster it anywhere. You cannot one-hand it, even though you may think you can, it's way too heavy to one-hand, and it's difficult to learn how to use. All in all, I give this weapon a 10 out of 10. Of course I'm joking, I know it's a chair, and I know you're not supposed to be able to holster it, I was just making a joke. But, honestly, that is actually really effective at being a weapon, so give it a try. Now lastly, I want to note that obviously your magic powers such as lightning and telekinesis, as well as random objects such as plates, mugs, etc., and larger shields can be used as weapons, however they're nowhere near as effective at anything on this list. Telekinesis can be used to drop items on people, but it's just not effective. It doesn't do enough damage, and the lightning's more just to stun people. So that's why they're not on this list.
So tune in next time where I fire way too many bullets, start throwing horseshoes everywhere, and eat so many meat products I have a heart attack. See ya.